Queens of the World. Anne, Queen of Great Britain and Ireland. Queen Anne was the younger sister of Mary II, half of England's only joint monarchy, William and Mary. When they died, Anne had no interest in sharing the throne with her own husband. She was the first married Queen of England to rule entirely on her own. She was a politically active and powerful queen who oversaw the forging of the new nation of Great Britain. She had a long-term, probably romantic, relationship with Sarah Churchill, but when political differences tore them apart, she transferred her affections to another lady-in-waiting, Abigail Marsham. Anne had 17 pregnancies, but none of her children survived. Her death meant the end of the Stuart Dynasty, and the throne went to her German cousin, George I. Let's examine the life of Queen Anne. Anne was born on the 6th of February, 1665, at St. James's Palace, London. Her father was Prince James, Duke of York, younger brother of King Charles II. Her mother, Anne Hyde, was a commoner whom James had fallen in love with and done right by when she became pregnant. She gave birth to 8 children, but only Mary and Anne survived to adulthood. A brother, James, Duke of Cambridge, was born between them, but he died of bubonic plague just shy of his 4th birthday. Younger brother Edgar also nearly made it to 4. The other 4 siblings all died before their 1st birthday. These tragedies surely marred Anne's childhood, though they were all too common in the 17th century. When Anne was 2, she developed an eye condition which caused excessive tearing. She went to France for treatment and lived with her paternal grandmother, Dowager Queen Henrietta Maria. Her grandmother died when she was 4, and she was sent to an aunt, Henrietta Anne, Duchess of Orleans. Her aunt died suddenly a year later, and 5-year-old Anne was sent home to England. Her mother died the next year. All of this tragedy and instability in her childhood had an indelible impact on her psyche. The sisters were raised Anglican, but their parents converted to Catholicism. As with most royal children of the time, Mary and Anne rarely saw their parents. They lived in their own household at Richmond Palace, where they were raised by a governess and servants. Private tutors were brought in, but the girls were mostly educated in the feminine arts. They were trained only to be good wives, despite the growing possibility that they would one day be queens. At the age of 6, Anne first met 11-year-old Sarah Jennings. Sarah was everything Anne was not and wanted to be. She was beautiful, graceful, and charming, with stylish blonde hair, while Anne was plain, mousy, sickly, and shy. Anne became devoted to Sarah, and their bond grew as they did. Sarah first entered the York household because her older sister Frances was Anne's father's mistress. When the Duke remarried to Mary of Modena, he appointed Sarah one of her maids of honor. When Sarah was 15, 25-year-old John Churchill fell in love with her. John's father disapproved of the match, as the Jennings family had very little money. John asked Sarah if she would become his mistress, but she refused. So he went against his father and married her. They had 7 children. Their daughter Anne is an ancestor of both World War II Prime Minister Winston Churchill and Lady Diana Spencer, Princess of Wales. When Princess Anne was 12, she contracted smallpox. She had to miss her sister's wedding to William, Prince of Orange. She recovered from the disease, but by that time, Mary had already left, though she was able to visit her in Holland the next year. Her second cousin, George of Hanover, visited London, sparking rumors of a potential marriage between them. But he was wed instead to a first cousin back in Germany. Her uncle Charles settled on Prince George of Denmark, younger brother of King Christian V, for her groom. He was Protestant and thus pleased the English. Plus, a treaty with Denmark balanced the treaty with Holland gained through Mary's marriage. But that meant brothers-in-law, William and George, were set against each other from the start. George was Anne's second cousin once removed. He was tall, blonde, handsome, and good-natured. He had served in the army and rescued his brother when he was captured by the Swedes. Anne and George wed in the Chapel Royal at St. James's Palace on the 28th of July, 1683. She was 18 and he 30. The couple got along well. He was unambitious and preferred relaxing at home to politicking at court. They set up their own household in England at the Palace of Whitehall. Sarah Churchill was appointed one of Anne's ladies-in-waiting. Within months, Anne was pregnant, but her first child was stillborn. She went to a spa town to recover. She next gave birth to Mary and then Anne Sophia in quick succession. In 1685, Anne's uncle Charles II died, and her father became King James II of England and Ireland and 7th of Scotland. George was appointed a privy councillor. William of Orange refused to attend the coronation, as he was insulted that his brother-in-law would have precedence over him. King James enacted unpopular religious reforms and promoted Catholicism. Anne and George were the only members of the royal family to attend Protestant services in England. When her father tried to get her to baptize her daughter Anne Sophia as a Catholic, she burst into tears and refused. The incident caused an estrangement between them. Anne wrote to her sister, "The Church of Rome is wicked and dangerous." When baby Mary was 2 and Anne Sophia just 1, they and George became ill with smallpox. Anne had already survived the disease and had immunity, but both of her daughters died. Her grief caused her to miscarry another baby. George recovered, and the couple often sat in silence, holding hands and mourning their lost children. Anne's stepmother, Queen Mary, had suffered similar tragedies. Despite 12 pregnancies, she had no living children. Though the king was unpopular, he was tolerated because when he died, his Protestant daughter, Mary, would become queen. But in 1688, his wife became pregnant for the first time since her husband's accession. She claimed that visits to a spa town had revitalized her fertility. But Anne wrote to her sister, sure that their stepmother was faking her pregnancy. When the queen delivered a healthy son, James Francis Edward, many were convinced that he was not the legitimate heir. Rumors ran wild that an imposter child had been smuggled into the birthing chamber in a warming pan. Now that there was a Catholic heir set to replace Mary and Anne, the people turned on the king. 7 English nobles wrote secretly to William and Mary, inviting them to invade and take the throne in what would become known as the Glorious Revolution. Anne was well aware of the invasion plan. Sarah Churchill advised her to back William and Mary from the off. Prince George briefly supported King James, but quickly changed sides when he saw it was clear that his father-in-law would lose. In fury and desperation, the king ordered Sarah Churchill's arrest. Anne and Sarah fled Whitehall in the dead of night. James lamented, "God help me, even my children have forsaken me." James fled to France, and Parliament declared William and Mary England's first joint monarchs. The new king and queen immediately hosted Anne and George. Anne showed no concern for their father's plight, and instead played cards. In thanks for their support, Prince George was created Duke of Cumberland, and Sarah's husband became Earl of Marlborough. Because Mary had suffered only miscarriages and had no surviving children, Anne was declared heir presumptive. 1689 was a joyful year for Anne. She gave birth to a son, Prince William, Duke of Gloucester, who, though weak and ill, survived infancy. But Mary's return to England did not turn out to be a joyful sibling reunion. Anne and George were often set against the king and queen. They squabbled over money, royal appointments, and rights. The king and queen feared that giving them too much money and power would allow them to organize a rival political faction. Anne requested the use of Richmond Palace. William and Mary refused. Then she asked Parliament for an allowance, which the monarchs tried unsuccessfully to block. Anne was furious when William refused to allow Prince George to serve in the military. Anne's close relationship with Sarah continued. They called each other by pet names, Mrs. Morley and Mrs. Freeman, so they would be equals within their relationship. Mary resented her sister's friendship. She and William suspected Sarah's husband of secretly conspiring with James's followers, the Jacobites, and dismissed him from court. Anne refused her sister's request to fire Sarah as her lady-in-waiting. She took her as her guest to a party at court, causing scandal. Sarah was banished from court, so Anne angrily moved out of her royal apartments. The king and queen gave Anne the silent treatment, stripped her of her guard of honor, and forbade courtiers to visit her. Anne gave birth to a son who died within minutes. Mary went to visit her, but instead of comforting her sister, she berated her for her friendship with Sarah. The sisters never saw each other again. Mary died of smallpox at the age of 32. William continued to reign alone, and Anne became his heir apparent. The Bill of Rights declared that if William remarried and had more children, they would come after Anne and her children in the succession. But William never bothered anyway. He restored Anne's honors and invited her to return to live at St. James's Palace. He gave her Mary's jewels, but kept her out of politics and refused to appoint her regent when he was abroad. Anne's final pregnancy ended in 1700 with a stillbirth. Over the 17 years of her marriage, she lost 17 children to miscarriage, stillbirth, or infant mortality. Modern medical historians have suggested a number of possible diagnoses, including lupus, pelvic inflammatory disease, intrauterine growth restriction, diabetes, or Hughes syndrome, an autoimmune disease which causes thick, sticky blood. Sticky blood has a hard time traveling through the small veins of a fetus. A now commonplace medication, aspirin, might have thinned Anne's blood and saved her baby's lives. Anne's only surviving son, William, Duke of Gloucester, was now the monarchy's only hope for the future. Though he was raised, like most royal children, by a governess, Anne visited him often, but his ill health was a constant worry to her. He suffered from numerous maladies, including hydrocephalus, an enlarged head caused by excessive fluid on the brain. This condition can cause developmental delays and can be the result of inbreeding. His parents were second cousins. Complications of inbreeding likely also contributed to the deaths of his many siblings. William was not able to walk properly until the age of 5, and he struggled to climb stairs throughout his life. His speech was delayed, and he had difficulty in his education. He was given command of a battalion of children playing soldier. He drilled them at Kensington Palace and performed well, impressing his aunt and uncle. 6 months after Anne lost her last baby, she attended William's 11th birthday party. After dancing, he complained of sudden fatigue and a headache and took to his bed. His mother sat beside him for 2 days while he was blistered and bled by physicians. The torturous treatments did nothing to help. William died on the 30th of July, 1700, with his parents beside him. William may have succumbed to smallpox or acute bacterial pharyngitis, but during his autopsy, it was discovered that his hydrocephalus was so advanced it was slowly killing him anyway. Anne and George were thrown into grief, and Parliament was thrown into chaos. Now there was only one Protestant heir in the line of succession, and the chances of another being born were nil. A few MPs wrote to James II's son, James Francis Edward Stuart, and suggested that if he converted to Protestantism, he might be offered the throne. He refused and plotted more bloody invasions instead. Parliament enacted the 1701 Act of Settlement. It skipped over 40 Catholic relatives and declared that after Anne, the crown would go to Sophia, Electress of Hanover, and her Protestant descendants. Sophia was Anne's first cousin once removed, the granddaughter of James I and VI through his daughter Elizabeth. In 1702, William III died, and Anne became queen. She was popular upon her accession. She gave a speech in Parliament distancing herself from her Dutch brother-in-law and reminding her people that she was entirely English. Unlike her sister Mary, Anne had no intention of sharing her throne with her husband. She was determined to rule alone. And George was perfectly fine with that. His contemporaries thought it unnatural that he made no moves to claim power from his wife. He responded, "I am Her Majesty's subject. I shall do naught but what she commands me." For centuries, he has been painted as an alcoholic dullard. Queen Victoria hoped that her own husband, Prince Albert, would never fill the subordinate part played by the very stupid and insignificant husband of Queen Anne. But perhaps today we can have more admiration for a husband willing to take a back seat to his powerful wife. Anne did name him High Admiral of the Navy, but this title was purely honorary. The real head of the military was Sarah's husband, John Churchill, whom she upgraded from Earl to Duke of Marlborough. George does not seem to have been concerned about his wife's intense friendship with Sarah. Queen Anne was a patron of theater, poetry, and music. She supported George Friedrich Handel, who composed a number of recognizable songs, including Zadok the Priest, which has been performed at every British coronation since. She also knighted great scientist Sir Isaac Newton. Annapolis, the capital of the American colony of Maryland, was named in her honor. The flower Queen Anne's lace is also named for her. According to legend, she was enjoying her hobby of lace making when she pricked her finger and a single drop of dark blood dotted the frothy lace, similar to the flower. The blossoms are symbolic of child loss. Anne made Kensington Palace, which had been renovated by her sister and brother-in-law, into her primary residence. But she didn't move into the Queen's apartments. Instead, she took over the King's rooms. She had this staircase designed with wide steps so that she could easily walk down with an elegant gown and high heels. And you'll notice that the rail was the first to have grooves for the thumb and fingers, as modern staircases often do. She also added a beautifully decorated greenhouse for outdoor entertaining. Anne took great interest in the affairs of state. Her reign saw more power in the hands of ministers than in the crown, and further development of the two-party system. The Tories were supportive of the Anglican Church and the landed gentry, while the Whigs were aligned with Protestant dissenters and commercial interests. Anne was a committed Anglican and favored the Tories. She supported a bill to exclude non-Anglicans from political office, but it failed. After the Great Storm of 1703 destroyed property and killed over 1,000 sailors, the Queen declared a countrywide fast to implore God to pardon the sins of the nation. She brought back the traditional religious practices of touching for the king's evil. Since the Middle Ages, it was believed that by touching sufferers of scrofula, known as the king's evil, the monarch could cure them. The practice was dismissed as superstitious by previous monarchs, but Anne reveled in the trappings of her divine right. England and Scotland were only joined by a personal union via the monarch. Many in Scotland were unhappy with the Act of Settlement and refused to accept a German heir to the throne. Many wanted to reinstate James II's son, James Stuart. Others wanted a Protestant heir, but from a different line than Sophia of Hanover, thus separating from England. But after 7 years of famine and a failed attempt to colonize Panama, the Scottish economy was ravaged, and they were in a weak position to make demands. The Parliament in London threatened that if Scotland refused to be united with England, all Scots would be treated as aliens south of the border. The Estates of Scotland acquiesced, and in 1707, the Act of Union bound England, Wales, and Scotland into a single sovereign state. Anne was now Queen of Great Britain and Ireland. James Stuart attempted to land in Scotland and raise support for an invasion. Parliament wanted to raise militia in Scotland, but Anne withheld her royal assent, fearing the militia would defect and join James. This was the last time a British sovereign vetoed a parliamentary bill. They needn't have worried. Bad weather blew James's ships away before he landed in Scotland. Anne's poor health, diagnosed as gout at the time and exacerbated by her many pregnancies, rendered her lame from this point on. She was carried in a sedan chair or used a wheelchair. She was carried to her coronation in a sedan chair. She drove a one-horse chaise around her estate. Her sedentary lifestyle caused her to gain weight, and she suffered depression. Carlos II of Spain, who also had hydrocephalus and other illnesses due to inbreeding, died childless, putting the succession in dispute between his Habsburg and French relatives, a fate Britain had narrowly escaped. Naturally, the English wanted to stick it to their longtime enemies, the French, so they supported the Habsburgs. The Whigs were in favor of the war, while the Tories opposed it. The Duke of Marlborough won a great victory at the Battle of Blenheim. Sarah badgered Anne to appoint more Whigs and reduce the power of the Tories, thus continuing the war and her husband's successes. The pair's political differences caused a fissure in their relationship. Sarah was confident in the Queen's love, and in her hubris, she overstepped her place. Around this time, Sarah introduced her own impoverished cousin, Abigail Hill, as a lady in the Queen's bedchamber. Sarah thought that Abigail would be her puppet, but she was mistaken. As Anne became disenchanted with Sarah, she came to rely on Abigail. Abigail was also related to a Tory leader, Robert Harley, and she acted as an intermediary between the politician and the Queen. Sarah was outraged when Anne gave her rarely used rooms at Kensington Palace to Abigail. She came to court with a bawdy poem written by a Whig propagandist, which implied that Anne and Abigail were lesbian lovers. She told Anne she had damaged her own reputation by conceiving a strange and unaccountable passion for such a woman, and that Abigail didn't have the education to be fit company for a great queen. At a service of thanksgiving for another of Marlborough's victories, the Queen did not wear the jewels Sarah had selected for her. The pair had a fight at the door of St. Paul's Cathedral, in front of the entire congregation. Sarah told the Queen to be quiet, and Anne dismissed her. Historians continue to debate if Queen Anne had romantic or sexual relationships with Sarah or Abigail, or if she saw them as friends only. The surviving letters between them are not especially passionate, but we can never know what went on in private. Prince George succumbed to severe asthma and dropsy at the age of 55. Anne was with him and continued kissing him until he took his last breath. He was buried in Westminster Abbey along with many of the children he and Anne had lost. Distraught, Anne allowed Sarah back at court, but rather than comforting her friend, she removed a portrait of George from the Queen's bedchamber and insisted that she move on and get back to work. She continued to tease Anne about Abigail and belittle and berate her on politics. Sarah couldn't take the hint that she was on thin ice. The ongoing War of Spanish Succession was draining the coffers and costing British soldiers and sailors their lives. The Whigs were falling out of favor, and riots broke out in London. Anne dismissed the Whigs and installed a new Tory ministry, which began to seek peace with France. To further tip the balance, Anne appointed 12 new peers to the House of Lords, including Abigail's new husband, Samuel Marsham. Britain left the war, and the Spanish throne went to the French candidate, Philippe, Duke of Anjou. Marlborough was dismissed as commander of the army, and Sarah was forced to resign her court offices. Abigail took over her job as keeper of the privy purse. Harley, now chief minister, was stabbed by a disgruntled French refugee. Anne fretted, but he recovered. Anne supported the Hanoverian succession in public, but it was rumored that she secretly hoped her half-brother would succeed her. She refused to allow any of her German heirs to visit England. Sophia of Hanover was 83. She was determined to outlive sickly 49-year-old Anne, but a letter from Anne accusing her of plotting to take the throne so shocked her that she died in June 1714. That year, Anne became increasingly ill. Harley became erratic and often appeared for meetings late, drunk and belligerent. The Queen fired him and attended 2 meetings with the Privy Council to determine his successor, but none could be agreed upon. The stress of politics, coinciding with the anniversary of her son's death, caused Anne to suffer a stroke. She took to her bed at Kensington Palace, unable to speak. She died the next day, on the 1st of August, 1714. Anne was buried at Westminster Abbey, with her husband George, son William, and many of her other lost children. Still bitter, Sarah Churchill wrote a scathing autobiography in which she besmirched Anne as a weak, irresolute woman beset by bedchamber quarrels and deciding high policy on the basis of personality. Generations of historians looked down on Anne's so-called petticoat government. But in recent years, Queen Anne has been better appraised as a strong ruler in a male-dominated world. She reigned over an age of scientific and artistic achievement and was politically astute. She attended more cabinet meetings than any of her predecessors. After her death, the crown went to Sophia's son, George, Elector of Hanover, now King George I, and a new German dynasty stepped onto the British stage. In next week's video, I will be examining the royal family tree to see exactly who was skipped over to make George I king. French princes, Italian kings, a queen of Spain, and a couple of Holy Roman empresses. Let's meet the many fascinating potential British monarchs that never were. Don't want to wait to see the next episode? Patrons get exclusive early access to all of my multi-part series. If you would like to join my Patreon and help me make more fascinating videos, click on the link in the description. Thank you for watching.